Hey there, everybody. Sage Popham here, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, and welcome back to The Plant Path. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the spring cleanse. You know, spring is coming up around the corner here, and this is a topic that is oftentimes brought up in discussion in terms of traditional Western herbal medicine. It's a question that I get a lot from students and people that follow the channel in terms of what is the spring cleanse, what herbs fit into that category, should I do it, why do I do it, etc. and so on. So I thought I'd take some time to talk about this subject a little bit. So the general premise of the spring cleanse is basically, it goes like this. Okay, so if we think about this in terms of how people used to traditionally live, I think it makes a lot of sense. And the premise is, okay, it's been, you're emerging out of a long, cold winter. Imagine when people lived a little bit more of a traditional lifestyle, maybe living on a family farm and things like that, the availability of fresh food during the wintertime was limited. So a lot of people were living off of sundries, preserves, canned food, dehydrated food, smoked food, and most likely a lot of meat. Especially if you live up north where it gets very cold and it's very difficult to grow things. Probably not a ton of fresh leafy greens coming out of the gardens, right? We're talking probably a substantial amount of root vegetables that tend to keep a little bit better throughout the winter, right? Your potatoes and your carrots and your beets and your celeriac and all of those roots that tend to keep a lot longer in a cold storage or things like that. So you've been eating nothing but meat and sundries and dehydrated preserved food all winter long. You're not eating much fresh plant-based foods. And now spring has come and you walk outside and the snow has thawed and there's fresh green leaves coming out of the ground. You want to eat those fresh greens, right? Those leaves have nutrients that your body is seriously lacking generally at that point of time, and providing some other medicinal properties that could prove to be very useful. So if we think of this, living a lifestyle in this way, you're eating a lot of heavier food, man, right? You're eating a lot of those root vegetables tend to be very starchy. Meat obviously is going to be a little bit of a heavier food, especially if it's a lot of red meat. A lot of those foods can tend to be a little bit more stagnating in the body, to be honest. They can sometimes be a little bit harder on the system. They can be, depending on how they're prepared, potentially not, they're just heavier foods. They're not as light food as we see in more aerial parts of plants, basically, like leaves and flowers and fruits and things like that. And so we can emerge from the winter season accumulating a little bit more dampness. Obviously, the winter season in and of itself tends to be cold. It tends to be more stagnating in general. Cold is not just a numerical value on a thermometer. It is an overarching quality of a slower metabolism, things not moving as efficiently and effectively in the body as they should be. Thinking of the digestive system is a good example of that, but circulation of the blood is also a very good example of that. Cold obviously diverts blood flow. This is why when you're cold, you tend to appear more pale because the blood is not reaching up to the surface and out into the periphery, hence you get cold hands and cold feet. So the winter season tends to produce this more, what we might think of as a cold depression tissue state. It can generate more of a damp or stagnation type tissue state. as everything is slowing down within the metabolism. And so these are two primary patterns that we can observe, dampness and cold. And so this in Ayurvedic terminology would be seen as an excess of the kapha dosha. And it's very interesting to consider that in Ayurveda, it is said that it is predominantly the kapha dosha that is accumulating through the winter months, especially that late winter, early spring time that we're, as this is being published at least, we're in currently. And so the premise is that as we're shifting out of that winter season and into the spring season, we want to do some transitional kind of protocols in order to clear that excess dosha accumulation within the system so that we can basically make room for that new quality to enter with the new season. And this is just a general understanding that we can gather from not just Ayurveda, but just really from observing nature, really. You look outside, the qualitative differences between the seasons are obvious from a weather standpoint to how we feel within ourselves, right? We tend to be a little more lively and energetic in the summer and a little more mellow and, inside more and maybe sleeping more in the winter time. These types of patterns affect our health, and it's generally a nice idea to try our best to orient our lifestyle, our patterns of living, our food, and even mild kind of herb protocols, I would say, like mild herb protocols to aid in those seasonal transitions. And the general premise is that, again, a particular quality accumulates in a season, and then it begins to decrease as that season is ending, while the next seasonal quality is rising. And this is really going to differ from place to place. It really depends on where you live. Now, Ayurveda, of course, has its own distinct pattern of the seasons and what doshas govern those seasons. But we have to understand that it's a very specific environment there where that system was developed. That's very different than if you live in Norway, which is very different than if you live in Mexico, which is very different if you live in Arizona or Washington State, which is where I live. So to me, it's very important to observe the nature of the ecosystem where you live, the energetic qualities and characteristics. And when I say energetic, I mean, temperature, moisture, tonal qualities of your environment, and how that affects you as an individual, your constitution, as well as how those qualities change through the seasons and adjust accordingly. But when we're specifically speaking to that transition from winter to spring, and I find those equinox transitions from winter to spring and from summer to autumn are very important, because we might think of the grand polarity of creation of the cosmos, right? We have from the Chinese perspective, yin and yang, or in alchemy, it would say celestial niter and celestial salt. We have these grand kind of polar qualities. And spring and summer tend to be more of those young celestial niter type qualities. The energy is moving upwards and outwards. It tends to be more warm. It tends to be more active and dynamic, right? The plants are growing and the birds are flying and we're gardening, and it's summer and we're moving and active and there's more sunlight. And then the fall and winter tend to be more yin. The qualities are moving down and in. The plants are dying back to the roots. The trees are dropping their leaves. We have an increasing quantity of nighttime versus daytime as we approach that winter solstice, etc. So it's just observing those things unique to where you live. But those equinoctial points, I think, are the most important, because that's where you're getting a shift from the yin seasons to the yang seasons at the spring transition, and then from the yang seasons to the yin seasons at the autumn transition. And so those are the major stark shifts, and I think it's important to consider those transitional times. So in Ayurveda, they say that Kapha, the Kapha dosha, which is marked by coldness, dampness, heaviness, and more of a tendency towards stagnation. These qualities tend to accumulate predominantly in the stomach as a primary site of accumulation in the digestive system, and then this can tend to reflex into the lungs. This is why anyone that has like an intolerance or issues eating dairy, they eat the dairy and then you get that phlegmy cough, or you have to cough up a little bit of phlegm, or you get that feeling in your throat. Dairy obviously is what we might think of as a kaphagenic food. It has all those qualities of kapha, so it tends to aggravate it in people with that predisposition. But this gives us a kind of a little bit of a hint in terms of where that quality tends to build up within the system in the stomach and then reflexing into the lungs. And so these are sometimes tissues or organs that we want to focus on in that transition to make sure that kapha is getting cleared out of the system in I suppose a more controlled way, or a healthy way, or an assisted way with our remedials and with lifestyle and food. If not, this is why it is very, very common for people to get sick during seasonal transitions. If you start paying attention to this, it's actually quite interesting how noticeable it is that people, more often than not, when they get sick, it is at those transitional points between winter and spring, summer and autumn and winter. Those tend to be the times when people oftentimes get your coughs, your colds, your flus, your RSVs, your COVIDs, things like that. And so in the winter to spring, especially though, because of the nature of the kapha dosha, and because of the correlation to the lungs, it is not uncommon for people to get respiratory tract infections during that transition. And again, this is because that kapha builds up in winter and it's trying to get moved out, and you just are more sensitive during those transitions because all the vital qualities are shifting seasonally externally, and they're shifting seasonally internally within us. So in the outer environment as well as in the inner environment. And generally, if we want to live a quote natural lifestyle or holistic lifestyle, I think this is a big part of it. It's not just, buying natural products instead of unnatural products, or eating organic instead of inorganic. It has to do with literally how you live. So attending to those seasonal transitions is very important. So springtime is officially here, and with it comes our astrological new year. I know the calendar turns over to the new year in January, but from the perspective of nature, it is really this time here in spring, around the equinox, when we enter our astrological new year. And this is always the time of year I love talking about the synergy of astrological medicine with clinical herbal medicine. And I want to make sure that all of you know that right now enrollment is open for our annual enrollment period for the Astro Herbalism course. This is the most in-depth and comprehensive course covering the synergy of astrological medicine and clinical herbal medicine from someone that actually uses it in practice, someone that really understands the herbs and has spent over a decade studying and exploring and practicing this model as an herbalist. So be sure to head on over to evolutionaryherbalism.com, where we've got lots more details there for you on the Astro Herbalism program. This is our annual enrollment period. You get into the program at a discount. You get additional bonus modules when you join now. So be sure to check out all of the details there at evolutionaryherbalism.com. So thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of The Plant Path. And with that, let's get back to talking about the spring cleanse. That brings us to what types of herbs do we usually consider during this time, during this spring cleanse, this spring transition? Well, when we're speaking about cleansing, we want to think about, well, what are the organs and systems and tissues of the body that might be affected by, say, more of a traditional lifestyle that people used to live? Well, if we're eating a predominance of sundries and preserves and meat, it's going to be much more likely that the digestive system will be a little bit more stagnant. Naturally, digestive fire tends to be at its lowest during the winter season as compared to the other seasons. So we can see a bit of stagnation in the GI. Possibly, bowel movements maybe are a little bit slower or less robust. We can see a bit more stagnation in the liver. This can then radiate outwards to a degree of stagnation, or what in the old text you see as toxin accumulation, or what's referred to as bad blood syndrome. I think it's worth clarifying when the term blood is used. From my understanding of it, it's not exactly you're talking about the blood flowing through your veins and arteries. Rather, it's speaking kind of like the greater blood is what I call it. The greater blood, which is, it encompasses kind of, I guess, the fluid element of the body. I think the way I tend to think of it is actually the extracellular fluid. It would be that, or the extracellular matrix, which is that fluidic matrix that is bathing the cells. And that is where all of the nutrients and things that you want to deliver to the cells gets squeezed out of the capillary beds and enters the extracellular fluid. The cell is bathed in that. The cell takes in what it needs from that environment. And then the cell expels its waste products into that extracellular fluid. And then generally we want those waste products to be delivered to our organs of elimination. That could be, if they're water soluble, direct delivery to the kidneys for excretion in the urine, or that could be delivery to the liver, whereby those substances are further metabolized. Either they are made water soluble and then delivered to the kidneys to be eliminated through the urine, or they are made or they are essentially going with the bile, so getting excreted from the bile into the digestive system to be eliminated through the stool. So that basically describes the process by which the whole category of herbal medicines that we refer to as alteratives operate on. So the alteratives, this is a very broad category of herbal medicine. It's, it's a useful category in that it gives you a pretty rough idea of what the herb does, but it's also in some ways not that useful because it's very non-specific. Like to just say, an herb is an alterative. Okay, that tells you it's working somewhere on that process. But there's a lot going on there. We're talking multiple organ systems, the digestive system, the liver, the gallbladder to an extent, but the liver tends to be more focused on the blood, the lymphatics, and by blood, I mean greater blood. The skin also as an organ of elimination through sweat, the kidneys and the urinary tract. Like that's a very large set of parts of the body. So to say an herb is an alterative is in some ways a little bit vague. And this is why generally when I'm classifying herbs, I like to know what type of alterative we're talking about. So are we talking about a digestive alterative, and the herb tends to be, maybe it's laxative or maybe it's bitter tonic and will just help drain things down and out. And bitters trigger bile secretions, which is our body's natural laxative. So bitters tend to have their own innate laxative effect to a degree. They're not the way we typically think of a laxative, like a stimulant laxative that's gonna, if you take too much, you'll have griping, spasmodic pain and, have to urgently run to the bathroom and hope something embarrassing doesn't happen. So you have your like digestive alteratives, which tend to be more bitter, tonic, or laxative. You have your hepatic alteratives that are typically going to be bitter in nature as well, because bitters have an affinity for the liver and the gallbladder. So we find a lot of our bitter alternatives tend to really work more that liver detoxification side of things. Then we have more of the lymphatic alternatives, which oftentimes are just referred to as lymphagogues. These are herbs that will help move the lymphatic tissue and fluids to relieve lymphatic swelling and stagnation. And some herbs can even be specific to certain areas. So some will really work on the throat region, some the inguinal region, etc. So you have your lymphatic alternatives. You've got your another subcategory that we might refer to as the antidyscratics. So this is an older term that refers to dyscrasias or blood dyscrasias, which would be an impurity of the blood. The antidyscratics usually are what we would refer to loosely or colloquially as blood purifiers. Again, this is the greater blood. These are herbs that are commonly used, and really alternatives in general, but especially the antidyscratics are the ones that are commonly used for skin conditions, inflammatory skin conditions, chronic skin conditions, acne, eczema, things like that. People that have a tendency maybe to boils and things of that nature, inflammatory skin conditions. And then you have your kidney urinary tract alternatives, which typically are diuretic or aquaretic remedies, which will essentially drain dampness from the tissues, increase urination, and thereby increasing elimination through that route. And that essentially is what defines an alterative. I guess I didn't define the term. An alterative essentially is an herb that will, I tend to think of them as working on the metabolic processes in general. But more specifically, they're considered herbs that operate on the channels of elimination. They open and move the channels of elimination of the body so that, again, bowel, skin, liver, essentially, kidney, urinary tract, blood lymphatics, all kind of are a part of that process of eliminating toxins and waste products. And this is why this is a fitting category for the spring cleanse, is because the channels of elimination can get a bit clogged up in the wintertime, again, if one is living maybe a little bit more of a traditional lifestyle, which I guess I will note not many people are doing these days. And I think that brings up a greater point here with the concept of a spring cleanse is it really appropriate for the modern human to do this when most people have access to food at grocery stores that probably is not seasonally available in that local environment, but because food is shipped all over the world now, we can get, fresh apples in the late spring and fresh greens grown in heated greenhouses or in California where they've got more sunshine, or avocados from Mexico and all that stuff. I mean, we can get all kinds of food all year round because of the global food system that is in place in many parts of the world. Not all, but many parts of the world. I get asked all the time what a reputable source is for acquiring good quality medicinal plants. And I want to make sure that you know about Natura Sophia Spagyrics. We are one of the highest quality manufacturers of alchemically prepared herbal medicines in the United States. And I am pleased to announce that we have a very large dispensary of herbal medicines, over 140 different single herbs, multiple different custom compounded formulas, spagyric essences, all prepared according to the ancient tradition of spagyric alchemy. So this is a good time for you to get stocked up on your spring cleansing herbs. So head on over to Natura Sophia Spagyrics. We'll drop a link in the description and get stocked up on some of your remedies that you will use for your spring cleanse. And so I think that brings up a bigger discussion is this really an appropriate thing to do? And I think it's an individual basis of how you live. Speaking of personally, in our household, we do tend to, we have been gradually moving to a little bit more of a traditional lifestyle. We don't go to the grocery store very often. We grow and raise most of our own food. We trade with some other local farmers for some food they grow, but we pretty much get most of our food locally and seasonally. And that has led to, wintertime is like, whoa, okay, we're getting down to it here, eating a lot more of our lamb that we raise, the chicken that we raise all of our own meat. And, it's like, wow, okay, this is a lot more meat than we're used to consuming. And there's just not as much fresh food coming out of the garden in the middle of winter here in Northwest Washington. And so that's why we've been really realizing the spring cleanse, this is why this was a part of some traditional cultures and lifestyles. It makes a lot of sense. So there's two parts of this. There's the cleanse the excess side, right? Of which the general goal is drain dampness. We want to warm up the cold. We want to disperse the stagnation. That's the way I think of it. We're draining damp accumulation, we're dispersing and stimulating stagnation, and we want to warm and disperse coldness as well. And of course, I think warming coldness is a general therapeutic guideline we use in the winter months anyways. So there's that side, the more mild alternatives. And I want to emphasize mild alternatives. I don't want you to go out there and look up alternatives and, see something like poke root or stillingia and be like, I'm going to use those for my spring cleaning. It's like, no, this is more your milder alternatives, like your gentle, mild alternatives, the herbs that literally would be growing up out of the ground in the early springtime are the ones that you would want to use. Now, the other side of this is nutritives, right? We want, if we're having a very limited diet during the winter season, generally you're probably going to develop a degree of nutrient deficiencies. And so especially, if you're eating a lot of canned food, canned food can definitely, I'm not saying it's devoid of nutrition, but I think canning does affect nutritional value of food. If you're just not eating a diversity of food, you'll end up with lack of diversity of nutrients. And so the nutritive tonic category of herbs is another really important aspect of the spring cleanse, or the spring, kind of the spring tonics is another way that these are referred to, because you're both, and there's herbs in this category that are both. They're mild alternatives, but they're also very nutrient dense. And they give you this broad spectrum of vitamins, of minerals, of, those micronutrients that sometimes we, only need tiny minuscule amounts of, but if you don't have that tiny minuscule amount of it, certain biochemical pathways in the body may not be running as smoothly and optimally. So that's the way I see the categories of the spring cleanse or the spring tonics would be your mild alternatives and your nutritive tonics. Is what you would be shooting for to clear out the excess, nourish the deficiency, and get your body kind of lightened up, loosened up, and ready to go about the more young seasons of spring and summer. So this is some of the strategies that I tend to think of for aiding in that transition from the winter season into the spring season. You want to try to clear out that dampness, disperse that stagnation, warm up the cold, get your immune system strong, and hopefully avoid those coughs, colds, flus, etc. that tend to hit at those seasonal transition points. So thanks so much for joining me in this video here, or whether you're listening to the audio, the podcast. Thank you very much. I do really appreciate you making it this far to the end. It really does help more than you might know. So I really appreciate it. If you're watching or listening anywhere other than our website, hit that like button, the subscribe button. It really supports the channel for us to be able to continue to produce good free content. And if you want more, head on over to evolutionaryherbalism.com to get more free content that we've got over there on the plant path. And once again, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join me. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care and be well.